Okay, so January tips. It's been an exciting month, to say the least. Before we get started on the monthly tips, let me go over a couple quick things with you guys that we're really, really excited about. One is our nooks. We have our Texas 5000 nooks. We have our Golden Cordovan, our ultra gentle nooks. And of course, we have our complete hives. And those are all available now. Some of those early dates are filling up very quickly. So if you're interested in nooks or singles or queens, please get those booked as quickly as possible. I mentioned this last time, we're actually selling package bees now. This is new for us. We've typically always stuck with nooks, but we realized that a lot of people want us to ship bees to them, or they really have, or they have used equipment, for example, and they say, you know, hey, I don't need a nook with a bunch of frames in it. I just need some bees to dump into my used equipment. And that's a great answer for this. By the way, somebody just asked a question. My first slide there said December instead of January. Yes, you're on the right place. I'm on the right month. I just forgot to change that December to a January. I need to take that first slide away. I feel like I do that every time. I forget to change that very first slide to the word January or the whatever month we're in. So you are in the right place. We are talking about January tonight. So package bees, we've got those with free shipping if you're interested in those. Okay, so this is the big one for this month. We launched a new website, and it actually just launched this afternoon. So I was so excited that it launched in time to tell you guys about it tonight. We're really excited about it. For time's sake, I'm not gonna bore you with too many details. Please go check it out. I think you're really gonna love how easy to maneuver it is. If you look at the main navigation menu up here in the upper right, there's some really cool things like really easy access to our free magazine. We have our monthly webinar archives on there. We also have a whole bee help and questions section of the website where you can search any beekeeping topic, or you can browse categories, and you can watch all our videos. We're posting about 30 to 40 new articles every single week on there, practical beekeeping articles. So that section of the website is just ever expanding, getting larger and larger, is for a resource for you guys. So go check out the new website. I think you'll love it. It's been a lot of work, but we're so excited that it's actually here. Sherry, do you want to jump on and fill us in on what's going on in the magazine this month?
I do. I do. Can you see me?
I can see you.
Hey, well, I can't see me, so we'll pretend like everybody. Yes, the magazine. This is a good month. This is our first 2021 edition, and look at that gorgeous picture on the front. And if that doesn't encourage everybody, I want these pictures. This is some folks up in Cold Spring, and this is gorgeous. This is a gorgeous winter day, isn't it? We want our magazine cover to be fitting to you. We want to see your pictures, so send them to me. And also, well, you went to the next slide, but I'm gonna go back on the magazine real quick. Like there we go. We've launched this month something that Blake and I have been working on for months, and it's the Ask the Experts segment. So what we've done is we have interviewed numerous people, your most asked questions, and we're getting their answers to your most questions. So on page 18 and 32, I believe, you're going to see two different questions answered by Cameron Crane, Michael Kelling, Dodie Stillman, Tara Chapman, and Harrison Rogers. These are experts, and you're going to get good answers. You're going to get all of their opinions. So then you can listen to it and make the decision for yourself for that. So I think that's pretty cool. Plus, there's great articles this month. We've got, Blake, you did something on almond pollination, which I think is cool. And you're going to have a follow-up on something even cooler for this next month's about almond pollination, grading bees. That's a little tidbit there. Shook Swarms, not named after you. It's very interesting little article. Beekeeping safety, and of course your monthly tips, and some other great articles. So it's a good addition, but I think they all are. So you want to get to the next slide, and I'll go over to the class.
Sure. There you go.
Perfect. this is our baby right here. We are starting in-person classes, y'all. January 16th at the Dayton location. We are thrilled, and we've got a lot of hours worked into completely revamping the program. It's an all-day 6-hour class, and anybody paying attention can see we got, for a limited time, a 10% discount code. Use that. We're going to buy you lunch. We're going to go out and play with bees. You will know how to get started and really and truly go through your first year of beekeeping.
Buy you lunch.
Buy you lunch. You heard James.
While we're immersed in bees.
Right. They'll be eating. But it's a great day. It's a good, fun day in that beautiful, beautiful new Dayton Huffman store. And we want to see you there. It's James and I are really, really looking forward to it. It's going to be a great day. So sign up. I want a full class. Oh, and when I say that, when I want a full class, we are COVID compliant here, folks. We're not taking this lightly. We want everyone to be prepared to wear a mask in class. We're going to have the seats spread out. They're going to be distant. We are well in front where we're not just breathing down your neck, and we're taking all of this very seriously. So your safety is our biggest concern, and I assure you that the store will be safe, and we'll all have a great day and learn a lot about beekeeping and walk away safe and sound. How's that?
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. Appreciate it. Okay, and just to chime in on Sherry's comment, if you don't need a beginner class, we also do advanced classes. We do classes on splitting and requeening and queen rearing and the business of beekeeping, et cetera. So check out our website. We have a lot of advanced classes. And for the beginning classes, we have those almost every weekend. So, check it in our Blue Ridge store and our Dayton store. And then we'll be doing a virtual class starting in the 1st of February. That'll be available to stream anytime. Okay, let's talk about bees. That's what you guys are here for. Let's get into it. So we've got some pretty exciting stuff tonight to go over. January tips. And, January for a beekeeper, for me, it's just exciting. I mean, we kind of sludged through November and December, and it was cold, and the days were getting shorter, and it was getting darker. And now, finally, the days are getting longer. We can see the end of the tunnel if you're listening to this in Texas. Spring is on its way, and we see little signs of that all over the place. These are some pictures that show some of those winter blooms. Really, I would call them early spring blooms that I'm starting to see. My two daughters and I were on a walk this past week, and this picture on the far left here, this is white clover, and I couldn't believe it. This was just along a sidewalk, and this was about a foot tall white clover in full bloom in January. So I don't know what it was thinking, but it was blooming. The next picture here, this tall yellow flower, this is what we call mustard. It's a yellow mustard. And this is one of the best early nectar and pollen sources in Texas. We don't usually see it blooming in mass until March, but we're already starting to see some blooms from some plants that never quite died off. Then, of course, that recognizable dandelion, they're coming up in all of our yards. And hopefully, if you're a beekeeper, you're not spraying them. You're just letting them go, letting the bees forage on them. But we've got the dandelions are coming on strong. And then the far right, the henbit, that purple flower, those are blooming as well. Now, these are all very, very minor trickles of pollen when the weather is just right. I mean, these aren't major flows in most cases. So, and it depends on where you are in the state. And we're going to talk a lot about that later. Where you are in the state, where you are in the country, depends a lot on what you're seeing right now. We're going to get into that a lot more. But in general, in Southeast Texas and North Texas, Central Texas, we're starting to see some dandelions crop up, some henbit, et cetera. Nothing major, but enough to give the bees a little bit of a trickle. Now, what we're all really waiting for, this probably looks like an ugly picture to some of you, but this is something that I am obsessively watching for all the time. I can't help myself. I'll often be driving in my truck out in the country, and I'm just staring intently at every tree we pass, every elm tree we pass, because This is a picture of an elm in bloom. Now, elm trees are all over the South. Well, they're all over the country, really. And they are one of the best early pollen sources in anywhere. And this, to me, this is kind of the elm tree is kind of kicking off the start of the real bee season, because it provides a flood of pollen that really kicks those queens into high gear. And if you're in, North Texas, this usually starts blooming the last week of February. I'm sorry, the last week of January or the first week of February. Southeast Texas, a couple weeks before that. So it just kind of depends on where you are in the state. But once you start seeing the elm trees bloom, hey, you better start watching the bees, because spring is well on its way. So current conditions, longer days are here. That's a good thing for the bees. Once the days start getting longer, almost no matter what the weather's doing, the queen begins laying and the bees start rearing brood. And it's amazing. So I want to give you a couple of fascinating examples of this. I remember, feels like years ago, when we actually had a decent snow in North Texas, where I live now, up in the panhandle of Texas. A lot of other states have gotten some great snow this year. But about 5, 6, 7 years ago, when we had a really good snow, I remember it was an incredibly cold January. I mean, just weeks. For us, our northern friends on the call tonight are going to laugh at this, but weeks in the 40s, where it didn't get out of the 30s and 40s. Incredibly cold for Texas, and it had been that way all of January. It was snowing on and off, and I remember going out and checking hives in mid-January, and some hives had a full frame of brood. And you could tell that queen started laying her eggs in early January, when those days started getting longer. And she didn't care what the weather was like. She started laying. And so we usually see that, we see that the queens begin laying, not a lot. I'm not talking about many frames of brood, but most hives you're gonna start to see some eggs in the hive. Now, sometimes if the bees don't have enough food resources, they may cannibalize those eggs or larvae and not raise them all the way to cat brood. But especially if you're in the southern part of Texas, Southeast Texas, you may have a frame of brood at this point, as the queens really start laying and as your trickle of pollen gets stronger. Overall, we had a warm December, and that has a lot of implications. A lot of folks were telling me, hey, we saw bees flying like crazy a lot of days in December. And then we also had our bees were eating a lot more in December, because when it's warmer and the bees are out foraging more often, they're burning energy. And so a lot of folks said, hey, our bees really went through more food than we thought. We need to start feeding. And also we were seeing bees doing a lot of flying. And so we'll kind of talk about that warm December in a minute, when we get into feeding and what you need to be doing and thinking about feeding this month. But it was a decently warm December. I mean, that's why we're kind of seeing some of those plants I talked about, they're blooming, because they never really died in the first place, or they came up in December. So interesting season. Every year is different. I mean, the bees are pretty good at handling the variety of weather that we have pretty much every year. Regions really vary greatly in December. This is when it's really important to watch your bees. This is not a time where you as a beekeeper should be just listening to exactly what I say, such as, oh, there's a trickle of a pollen flow, and just trusting it explicitly and saying, oh, that must mean there's a trickle of a pollen flow in my area. Because this time of year, January and even into February, it's one of the times of year where we just have a huge difference in what your bees are doing, depending on where you are geographically. And so if you're in Southeast Texas or South Texas or North Texas or Oklahoma or Alabama or Pennsylvania, there's going to be a huge difference in what your bees are doing in January, February. Now, once we get later in the year, our bees kind of sync up a little bit more, and they're behaving more similarly. They've all got brood at a certain point of year. Honey harvest comes, summertime, et cetera. But this time of year, there's a huge difference. So the picture on the far left, I mean, that's what we're seeing up in the panhandle right now in a lot of states. In the middle here, you can see this is a picture. This bee just has one, there's one bee on the entrance with a little bit of pollen coming into the hive. That's kind of what I'm seeing in North Texas right now. On warm days when the bees can fly, they're bringing in a little bit of pollen. The picture on the far right is kind of what I've been seeing in random areas of Southeast Texas, not all of Southeast Texas, but some areas in Southeast Texas. I mean, every bee coming in has pollen on their legs, which means they're going to start growing and needing even more food if they don't have enough. So watch your bees. Go look at the entrance on that warm day when the bees are flying. Are they bringing in any pollen? If they're bringing in a lot of pollen, that's a great sign that, hey, that hive is going to start growing. They're going to start rearing brood, etc. If they're not really bringing in any pollen, you know, you may still have a few weeks before they really start growing. This is kind of what I'm seeing inside hives right now. It varies a lot. Most hives that I'm looking at right now have some eggs, but you know, this frame of brood here on the far left, this is Southeast Texas. You know, you've actually got an entire band of pollen right now, and then this is all developing brood here in the middle. The center picture here, it's hard to see because you got all the bees, but you've got a little patch of brood, and the far right, this was North Texas, where tiny bit of cat brood on one frame, little bit of eggs and larvae, but not a whole lot. So you're going to kind of see this spectrum of what's going on in your hives. And by the time we get to mid-February, you know, we're going to have a lot of brood in all of our hives if you're in the South, but or late February especially. But January, again, there's just kind of a big difference in what you're going to see in your hives. We talked about open pollen feeding in December. That works really well when there's no natural pollen flow or virtually no natural pollen flow. You can still do some open feeding, but as those plants start blooming, the bees are always going to gravitate towards natural pollen. So the ideal time to do pollen feeding is kind of in the dead of winter when there's nothing blooming. You know, we're kind of, the countdown clock is ticking as far as how much longer you're going to be able to do any open pollen feeding. And that's okay. As we've talked about, open pollen feeding is nice, but it's not critical. It helps the bees, but it's not something that's essential. We talked about this too, you know, bees foraging on animal feed, sawdust, bothering the neighbors in the wintertime as they kind of look for anything that even sort of resembles pollen. We should only have a few more weeks of that happening. You know, once a natural pollen flow really starts kicking in, hopefully they'll stop bothering your chickens and we can all go back to normal. But if they are still doing that, if they're still bothering you, that open feeding of pollen substitute can really help. It helps them divert their attention from the chicken feed and the sawdust to that open dry pollen. You're going to see this more and more as the weather warms up progressively. Cleansing flights, you know, there's a big difference in cleansing. A lot of people get confused between cleansing flights and robbing. A lot of people see a lot of bees coming and going from their hive and they say, oh no, my bees are being robbed. Oftentimes this time of year especially, it's the bees going on a cleansing flight because they haven't been able to get out and go to the bathroom in a week because the weather's been cold. So you can go to our website or our YouTube videos or some of our, I think our July TBS Monthly magazine had an article about robbing and what that looks like and had some videos. But robbing usually looks like a lot, you know, a ton of bees fighting. There's going to be dead and dying bees all around the front of the hive. There's going to be bees attacking every seam between boxes, trying to get up underneath the lid. If you just got a bunch of bees coming and going from the entrance, that's not usually a sign of robbing. It's more of a cleansing flight or an orientation flight of new bees. Okay, so back to January, syrup feeding. The title I put up here is The Roller Coaster Begins, because this is the time of year where the weather does a lot of up and down. I mean, we see a really cold week, and then we see a week where we get up in the 60s or 70s and the bees are flying and the queen's laying. And then all of a sudden we'll have a cold front that lasts for a week or two where the bees are barely flying. So here's some general rules when it comes to feeding in January. Now, if you remember back in November, December, we talked a lot about, oh, you need 30 to 40 pounds of honey or syrup up in your second box. Well, now that number starts to decrease because we're getting into springtime and we're not needing the bees to, and we're not really getting into springtime, but we're getting into later winter. And the bees don't need 30 to 40 pounds anymore because it's not that long before spring gets here. So now you need to think about maintaining more like 20 pounds of honey or syrup up in your second box. So you should have, 3 to 4 deep frames down in your bottom box with honey or syrup, 3 to 4 mostly empty frames for that queen to start laying in. Your second box should have more like 20 pounds. That's going to be a medium super about half full, or a deep super, with 3 frames or 4 frames of honey or syrup in it. And that's kind of what you're going to maintain through January and February, as we're just kind of maintaining a little bit lower reserves as we get more into springtime. If you do need to feed, if you're under that 20-pound reserve in the second box, then feed 2-to-1 syrup rather than 1-to-1 syrup. And then continue using a division board feeder or a top feeder rather than those entrance feeders. Those entrance feeders we don't really want to use until we get well into spring. Final note on feeding syrup, especially in late January, start monitoring those food stores more closely, especially a food per hive basis, because as we get warmer and as those queens really start laying and as we get cold fronts, the bees can go through a lot of food quickly. And what we often see happen is, we get into February and we think, oh, I see flowers blooming. My hive had 15 pounds of extra honey in the second box. I think they're okay. And then we get a cold front that lasts for a week or 10 days and the bees can't forage much, or we get a late freeze in March and it kills a lot of the nectar producing plants. And all of a sudden we've got a hive without a lot of food reserves and several frames of brood that they're trying to feed and take care of. So suddenly, they can go hungry, they can starve really, really quickly. So keep an eye, once a week this time of year, not January, but once we get to mid-January and especially late January, once a week, go out there and lift up on the hive, open the top, quick glance at a few frames really quickly and make sure they've got the food reserves they need, so that on those cold weeks, as they've got a lot of brood, they don't starve to death. And we don't usually see hives unless they're completely out of food. A hive doesn't always starve to death, but what they can do is they can start cannibalizing brood, and that just slows down their growth. So we really don't want to see them cannibalizing brood. We want them to keep rearing that brood so they can grow faster. Feeding pollen patties, it's not as critical as it was back in the fall. I'll just throw this out there for the fun of it. I've been noticing a lot of there was an article in, I think it was ABJ, the American Bee Journal, maybe, yeah, it's in ABJ, that's been kind of making the rounds. It was an article about, is pollen substitute as helpful as we all thought it was? And it's a great question. It's a really good question. And it's one that should have more research. And I'm participating in a research study with a lab in Tucson, digging into pollen substitute a little more deeply. But the article's premise was based on some studies in the early 2000s. Pollen substitute doesn't actually help that much any time of the year. I would refute that. I think I know that there are an equal number of studies that show pollen substitute is very beneficial and have been thoroughly shown to be beneficial. Another problem is the study that was shown in ABJ, the article, was based on studies that were done in the early 2000s. Pollen substitute mixtures have changed dramatically in the last 20 years since those early studies were done. And there's really no comparison to what's in pollen substitute now versus what it was in the early 2000s. So anyway, I thought I'd throw that out there. Feeding pollen patties in January can help build up that early brood. Once we get in Texas anyway, once you start seeing the elm tree bloom and those, every other bee coming in has pollen on her, I wouldn't really feed pollen substitute regularly. Until then, so through the month of January, it's definitely not going to hurt to give them a couple patties just to get that brood rearing kick started. Not critical, but not going to hurt. The one time I would feed pollen substitute, whether it's January, February, or March, is when I mentioned a second ago, when we have a really cold week or 10 days in February, in March, where the bees can't forage much. That's when I really go in and throw a pollen patty in. And we'll talk about that way more in February and March. But during those extended periods when the bees can't fly, as they've already got frames of brood, that's when I really start paying close attention to the feed. Quick note on combining hives in January. If you're going to combine hives, if you've got a weak hive and you want to combine them, um, make that determination on a day that's at least 60 degrees. Don't go out and look at your hives at a 50-degree day and say, oh, they look too small, I need to combine them, because bees really shrink and cluster when it gets cold. So, make those judgment calls on a warm day. I would say in January, combine hives that are 2 frames of bees or less. If they're more than that, I mean, it's kind of like point number 3 there. I mean, if they've made it this far, uh, it's not going to hurt to give them a shot. It's not like they're going to take much more feed or anything. So this time of year, even if they're 2 frames of bees, 3 frames of bees, I'd give them a shot. They're probably not, you're not going to be able to split them in March or anything, but they might grow enough to possibly make a honey crop or even survive if you give them a shot. Hive inspections. Okay, so what do you need to be looking for when you go into your hive in the month of January? Here's what you should see and here's what you should look for. You should see minimal but increasing brood. Again, region dependent, but in most hives and most regions, you should see some brood. Now, by brood, it could be eggs, could be larvae. You may even be seeing some cat brood. I was visiting with a beekeeping friend of mine in Florida, and they're near Miami, Florida, and they've already got like 3 frames of brood in their hives. So we're not quite to that extreme, but in some far southern areas of the state, you might have a frame or 2 of brood already, versus North Texas, where you might just have a few patches of eggs and larvae. You should see some pollen stores. Again, not much. The bees in the colder areas, they may be consuming it as fast as they're bringing it in, but you'll probably see some pollen stores. And again, you should make sure you've got at least 20 pounds of honey stored up in that second box. Okay, this is a common question I wanted to touch on. I've gotten a lot of folks asking this. Is my hive queenless or just not raising brood yet? And this is a really common question, because a lot of beekeepers look at their hives in December and they say, I don't see anything. Or you might be looking at your hives in early January and be going, I don't see any eggs in my hive. Are they queenless? How do you tell if a hive is queenless when there isn't supposed to be much brood rearing? If it's April and you don't have brood in a hive, they're queenless. Or if it's even March or mid-February, don't have brood in a hive, they're definitely queenless. That's one of the primary ways we tell if hives are queenless or not. So in the winter months, or in times of season, in times of year like this, where there may or may not have brood, how do we tell? I want to give you some key questions to think about and to look at when it comes to making that determination in the non-brood rearing months. I would look at pollen flow and food stores. If a hive is starving, good chance they're not going to be raising much brood. The queen's probably still laying, but the bees are cannibalizing, eating those eggs as fast as she's laying them if they're starving. So if you have no excess honey in the hive, I mean, if there is half a frame of honey in a hive total, they're starving to death. I wouldn't expect to see much brood. What's the pollen flow doing? Again, if you're seeing just a tiny, tiny trickle of pollen coming in or no pollen, I wouldn't be that worried about seeing eggs and larvae. It could just be your hive didn't store up enough pollen in those combs last fall to start rearing brood in January, because they gotta have protein, they gotta have pollen to rear brood. So if you're not seeing any pollen reserves, you're not seeing any measurable amount of pollen coming in, it's okay. They probably just haven't started yet. What are the weekly temperatures? If you're in northern states where it's still 30s during the day or colder, or it's rarely getting above 40, I wouldn't be that concerned about not seeing eggs in the hive. Thirdly, did you have eggs and brood in your hive in the fall? What'd your hive look like in the fall? If you suddenly in September or October you didn't see any eggs or larvae, and you still don't see any, okay, they're probably queenless. But if you were seeing plenty of eggs and larvae going into winter, you're probably okay. What's the population of the hive? Stronger hives with more bees tend to start raising brood, and you'll see eggs a bit earlier than weaker hives. So if you've got a hive with 10 frames covered front and back with bees, and it's mid-January and they've got plenty of food, I would expect to see eggs. If I'm not, I'm concerned. Versus if you've got you know, if it's the same conditions, but you've only got 2 frames of bees or 3 frames of bees, I may not be expecting to see that until February, because again, if they're not keeping the hive as warm, they don't have the resources to rear brood quite as early. And then finally, compare it to your other hives. What are your other hives doing? Are all your other hives rearing brood? And you've got this one hive over here that isn't. And it's good population wise and food wise. That's a sign they're probably queenless. So, you know, that's why I always encourage everyone to have more than one hive, if at all possible, because you can really compare those results to see what's normal, what's not. So hopefully some of those steps will help walk you through, you know, could they be queenless, could they not? This time of year, I usually tell people, don't panic, give it a few more weeks. It's not like you can get queens right now anyway. So give it a few weeks, check again. If your hive does become queenless over the winter, you can try a couple things. One, you can try ordering a queen from Hawaii. Hawaii sells queens year round. Now they can be a little hard to get, but look up Kona queen breeders in Hawaii. There's a couple others. Big Island Queens is another one. Oliveras is another one. They sell queens year round. So you may be able to get lucky and snag a queen from Hawaii. The other option is just give that hive, you know, once February rolls around and they really start rearing more brood, give that hive a frame of brood from a stronger hive and let them raise their own queen, because you probably won't be able to get a queen here on the mainland USA until late March, early April. So you can give them a frame of eggs and larvae and brood to let them start rearing their own queen early. Now that's going to come with some risks, because that queen's going to have to mate with drones, and you just have to hope that there's enough drones that early in the year to mate with a queen. But it's worth trying. So, and you can kind of keep giving them frames of brood and eggs, etc., through February to keep them boosted up as they raise their new queen. Okay, that was just a freebie. I didn't mean to get so much into that one. Quick reminder here, this was in our January TBS monthly magazine, and it was in our December magazine, when to look at hives, under what conditions should you be able to look at hives. So I won't spend much time on this. We also talked about it in December, but just as a reminder, this is the conditions at which you can look at bees. And this is just Blake's opinion. So I'm sure there's others that have other opinions, but I've looked at a lot of bees in these conditions. So if you're looking at a hive less than 1 minute, not pulling out frames, just make sure it's ideally above 32 degrees. If you're looking at a hive for more than 1 minute, pulling out a frame quickly to look, sunny and above 40 degrees. If you're pulling out several frames, doing a more thorough inspection, make sure it's sunny and above 50 degrees. Ideally, look at hives in January during the heat of the day, several hours before dark, to allow that cluster to reform before it gets chilly at night. And remember, it's always better to look at bees than not. The bees can handle cold really, really well. I've looked at bees in the snow. I've looked at bees when it's 10 degrees outside, etc. And as long as you're not spending long in there, they do just fine. It's far worse for them to run out of food. A couple other quick, I'm going to kind of go over some random things here that you may see in January that a lot of people have questions about, but moldy frames comes up a lot, and we tend to see this in a couple different situations. The picture on the left was stored honeycomb with honey in it, and you can see that white and green mold kind of developed on those frames. And then the picture on the far right, this was a hive that actually died and developed some mold. And this is actually really common in stored equipment or hives that died. There's a lot of moisture oftentimes in a hive, and this white green mold, this white green fuzzy mold, seems to just love dead bees, seems to love honeycomb, love honey. And a lot of people panic, understandably. It looks awful. You know, what on earth is going on? And I've seen, you know, these are kind of mild pictures here. I've had frames that the entire frame was just a massive mold. And so a lot of people obviously want to know, well, should I burn it? Should I get rid of it? What should I do? My recommendation when this happens is, if it's an entire frame, front and back, just totally mold, I throw it away. But if it's, you know, a third covered in mold, or like these pictures here, I brush the dead bees off. I rinse it off with a water hose, shake all the water out of it, let it dry. ideally in a low humidity area. So you can buy a cheap dehumidifier for 20 bucks on Amazon. Put it inside a container, an ice chest or an old freezer with your frame, suck that water out of the, so it removes that water out of the frame because you just washed all that mold off. Or, if you don't mind, stick them in your house for a few days and that'll pull the water out. But one way or another, wash them, dry them, they're perfectly fine to reuse. I know a lot of beekeepers, and I've done it before, where I've just got a bee brush, brushed all that I could off and just put it directly into a hive. The bees seem to clean it up, no problem. And the mold doesn't seem to hurt them at all. So don't panic. If it's a severe case, wash, dry, reuse. If it's kind of like these pictures, brush off what you can, and you can just put it back for the bees to start using again. Another thing you may see this time of year, and especially as we get into early February, dead bees at the front of the hive. The picture on the left here is very abnormal. This is what I would call a pesticide kill, or something majorly wrong is going on in those hives. Like the Varroa mite levels are out of sight, and the hives are dying off quickly. I've seen this a few times, unfortunately, in my own bees, where you go out to the hives and there's just piles of dead bees out in front. Couple different conditions happen. I've seen this happen when bees are robbing out another hive. So when a hive is being completely robbed out, you'll see kind of just that mound of sickening dead bees there. If a hive has incredibly high Varroa mite levels, you can kind of see these piles of dead bees in the front, or pesticide kills, or if a hive has starved or is on the verge of starvation, you can see this too. That's not normal. You don't want to see that. What is normal is the picture here on the right, where you've got a couple dozen dead bees, maybe a scattering of dead bees out in front of your hive. That's pretty normal because your winter bees are starting to die off. And so don't worry about seeing, a handful of dead bees every day as those winter bees progressively die off. That's perfectly normal. It's been really interesting at our if you haven't been at our store near Houston in Dayton, we're building one for our Blue Ridge store. But we created this huge indoor hive. It's about 4 foot in diameter by 4 feet tall, and we installed a bunch of bees inside of it. And it's a free hanging hive. And we started it right in October, right when the store is opening. Not a great time to get bees to draw this natural hanging comb. They did a little bit, but not much. But it's been interesting though, because it's a huge indoor observation hive, and you can see the bees dying over the winter. And so back in October, November, there was just this huge cluster of bees, and every day it's a little bit smaller, and there's a few dead bees on the bottom of that huge observation hive. And so losing a couple dozen bees a day or 100 bees a day is pretty normal for this time of year. Okay, with that, let me jump back here, because before I let James and Sherry jump on, they're going to talk about another really important topic, which is reversing boxes. I for some reason, I don't have the slide in here, guys, so I apologize. But I did want to touch on Varroa mites just briefly, because I also get a lot of questions on what to do about Varroa mites. The slide I was going to show you just had a big scary Varroa mite on it. It didn't have any terribly pertinent text, so I'll just tell it to you. But for Varroa mites, you can treat them in January if you have a problem. I'm not a huge fan of treating in the dead of winter, because when a hive is clustered really tightly in the hive, when bees are clustered tightly in the hive, it's hard for a lot of treatments to kind of penetrate that cluster like it needs to and treat Varroa mites. So if you do need to treat though, late January, early February is a great time, because there isn't a whole lot of brood. The bees haven't brooded up a lot yet, but they've started to break that cluster a lot of days. Varroa mite treatments work infinitely better. Any treatment works better for Varroa mites when there isn't as much brood in the hive, because remember, those Varroa mites hide underneath that capped brood, and that's where they do a lot of the damage. And until those Varroa mites emerge from that brood, the treatments, whatever it is, can't kill them. And so when you don't have any brood in the hive, or you have very little brood in the hive, and you use a treatment, it's way, way more deadly to the Varroa mites. So late January, early February is a great time to treat for mites. That being said, if you tested for Varroa mites in November, I'm going to say October or November, and you were under 2 mites per 100 bees, you shouldn't have a problem, because mites have to have brood to reproduce. And if there wasn't brood over the winter, they shouldn't have reproduced to any large extent. Now, once you get into February, March, you're going to want to start that testing back to make sure that they weren't reproducing as your brood reproduces. But if you were under control going into winter, you're not going to be out of control until well into the spring is when you need to be concerned. So if you were under control, treated and tested, and mites were under control going into winter, wouldn't worry about it. If they weren't under control, or if you did a test recently and they are too high, then you really have a lot of options at your disposal for testing for treating. You can use, my recommendation would be going with HopGuard, formic acid, or oxalic acid. Those are really good treatments. They're very natural treatments. They are not synthetic chemicals like Apagard is. Like Apavar is. And so they're very natural treatments, pretty easy on the bees, except for formic acid. It can be a bit tough on them. But, especially HopGuard, et cetera, those are treatments I don't usually recommend because they don't always work great when there's a lot of brood in the hive. But early in the season, like we are right now and still through most of February, those treatments tend to work really well. So I would steer you towards those more natural treatments this time of year and through February to treat for mites. One other quick note, if you are going to test for mites, I would do it on a warm day above 60 or around 60 degrees, because you're going to have to open up that hive. And I'm going to, once it warms up a little bit and I can get back into the bees routinely, I'm going to refilm our video on testing for Varroa mites, because there's a couple things that have come to light recently that you need to be doing when you're testing for Varroa mites that I don't think I included on that video in our YouTube channel. And that is when you're getting bees to test for Varroa mites out of your hive, you want nurse bees. They tend to have, for a lot of reasons, we won't get into it for time's sake, but you want nurse bees. So you want them from the center of the hive, the bees that are on the brood. That's step number one. And then you also want, when you put them in that easy mite check little cup with the alcohol, you want to swirl them around for at least 60 seconds. It takes at least 60 seconds to dislodge all the Varroa mites in that container. And then you also want to use at least a couple of cups of alcohol solution in order to make sure that those Varroa mites are fully dislodged as you're swirling them and sink to the bottom of that little testing container. So make sure you're following those steps, and if you are using alcohol, it needs to be at least 90% alcohol, 90% solution. The lower percentages don't dislodge the mites as well. You can also use 2 tablespoons of Ultra Dawn dishwashing soap to a gallon of water as a solution. Other brands, believe it or not, other brands of soap don't tend to work as well. So the Ultra Dawn dishwashing soap or 90% alcohol. So anyway, I'll remake that video here sometime soon and repost it, and hopefully that will be helpful for you guys. Okay, James and Sherry, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to talk about reversing boxes, and then we'll wrap it up with a poll and some more Q&A time, and I'll jump on to answering your questions as James and Sherry share their screens.
And there we are. Let's see. Okay, it's got this in the... Hi, everybody. I wish you could see what I said. There he goes. It got out of my way.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Blake, thank you. That was all really beneficial.
It was.
We all learn something every time we put on a presentation,
sure
and that's the reason we all attend. It's
That's
amazing
true.
how many compliments are received over the Q&A file as opposed to only questions.
It's the truth, Blake. You should go back and read them. I know you do anyway, but there are.
I should do this for a living.
You should do
Well,
it. The questions
That's
are
right.
so good, y'all. Everybody, the questions are so good.
We could hire Blake to be the editor. He was talking about. Okay,
All
reversing
right,
brood
enough,
boxes.
enough. All right, so reversing brood boxes. This was our topic for the day. And your article, James wrote an article about it in the January edition of Texas Bee Supply Monthly. It was a good article.
Well,
And we kind of
thanks.
expanded on it and made it a program for tonight.
This
So-
slide number 1 that we're looking at is actually showing the land surrounding the new location in Dayton.
It is.
This is on the side of the property where we have some bees stored,
Uh-huh.
just so you have a feel of what the terrain is and
It's
where
beautiful.
what it looks like. It's out in the country.
Beautiful.
It's awesome.
Beautiful. All right, let's get started. Reversing brood boxes. There's a theory behind that.
Well, there's got to be a theory behind everything
There
done
is.
there. The concept of reversing boxes is done to help compensate what the bees typically do during the winter months. As they move up for stored honey, a colony of bees has a band of honey stored above the brood nest, and they move up into that constantly. And as the winter gets further and further along and they've consumed more and more food, their resources are up above them as opposed to below them.
That's right.
So the concept here is considering whether or not we need to kind of help things out by readjusting that brood nest. And is that going to do us any good?
Right. And so as they've moved up, they're just inhabiting that top box. It really opens you up to some expansion limitations for the spring that's coming, y'all. It's coming right around the corner. It's hard to believe because like Blake was talking about, it's cold here to us. But really and truly, we've got to start thinking about that expansion time that's just right around the corner.
Some people will say, that the queen will move down on her own, that the box will automatically reverse itself.
And then she can.
And that, you talk about Varroa hives and a variety of reasons or theories as to why we don't have to do this. But as we go into this program, we'll see that we have some principles or basics that we want to look at as we're managing each colony individually. Most of us don't have thousands of colonies.
Right.
Most of us have
Few.
numbers that we can spend some time and pay attention
Right.
to and make a decision individually. Discussing how we reverse brood boxes, the next slide shows
That's right.
that.
It does. So your goal, and you do have a goal with this, there's a method to this, and that is move the brood nest to the lowest point in the hive, giving you free space above for expansion. It makes sense. When you look at this diagram, and we want to give Paul Longwell credit for this diagram, it's a very, very good diagram. It shows you what you're looking for, what the yes and what the no is, because that's really important, y'all. When you start looking at that diagram, the one on the top, it shows that brood nest has moved up, chasing their resources, what we talked about, and not down on the bottom, where you normally would think that they would have started. Of course, that's where they started.
Well, and that's not all inclusive in that just because we're showing a box of bees that the brood nest has completely moved to the top box, that doesn't mean that's what yours looks like at all.
No.
It's quite possible yours looks like the one underneath it, where the brood nest is split between the two.
And what does it say beside that?
It says
No, don't do that.
It's possible that if you live in Conroe, Texas, or Galveston, Texas, or Corpus Christi, that your brood box is completely full.
That's right.
Who knows what you're seeing? So therefore, we go back to the thought that each individual box needs to be explored to determine if a step is required regarding reversing boxes.
And before I move to the next slide and talk about the no, just see how easy this is, because really and truly, once those bees have moved up and consumed all of the honey in the bottom, they've moved up chasing the heat and the food source, just reverse the boxes, put the bottom on the top and the top on the bottom. It's really easy. And if you're by yourself, just set one over on its side, move the other one, set it on its side, and reverse their places. It works very, very well.
Let's talk some more about the slide on the right as we go to our next one, where we said no. There's a concept that we all are familiar with called splitting the brood nest.
Yes.
And it could occur in a lot of situations as we manipulate our colonies,
True.
if we do manipulate our colonies. And make no mistake, a box reversal is a manipulation. While we may not be moving individual frames, if we're splitting a brood nest and we're separating the queen from what was a cohesive cluster, and now we're breaking it into individual components, we can expect that there will be a result or an action from that.
There is.
Who was it? Newton.
Oh.
Newton had, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, that doesn't specifically apply here, but the concept applies.
Kind of does.
And that if we do something to alter what's naturally occurring within our box and we don't understand the reason that we did it, then there will be a reaction to our action.
Somebody once described it as if you've got a football, which we know brood cluster is kind of a football shape. If you take that football and you split it in half, you put two football ends together, there's got to be some correction there. The bees are not going to be thrilled that you've done that. So you really want to make sure that those bees have moved up before you've made the decision to reverse those boxes.
Let's go back to that previous slide if we can, honey. It's if you look at the on the right-hand side, it shows the brood area and also shows honey stores. Another reason that we don't want to bust that brood nest up is our bees, as I mentioned, store their honey up above the brood or above the brood area. And that if we break that, what have we done? We put a band of honey directly across the top of the bottom.
Almost like blocked it in.
The bottom cluster. And you'll find in your readings that bees, that the queen specifically does not like to cross a band of honey. So you could lock her into that bottom box rather than giving her an additional space up above. And another thing that we've done, if the majority of that box is now split in half where it's equal, where's the top box that's away from the queen? Where's it going to get its nurse bees? Or where's it going to get bees for help, for heat?
That's right. And just wait until the population is good and strong and that they've really and truly created that hourglass that allows you to do that reversal. And where both segments of the brood are protected. You definitely want it. $1 million question.
Here we go. And this is something I like to harp on because I'm not a firm believer that every colony has to be reversed by any means. We're talking about double deep boxes. But the reason that most people would consider doing a reversal is for swarm control. During the spring, when our nectar flow begins, if all of our bees have moved up to the top box, or the bulk of them have moved up to the top box, nectar and pollen start coming in. Our bees have to have some place to store it, so there becomes a competition between the queen for egg laying space and the forager for resource storage. And that competition typically ends up with nobody winning, and that the colony tends to swarm due to a lack of space.
That's true. That is true. Yeah, just make sure that, I mean, it doesn't have to be done. As a matter of fact, there's studies of people who just don't reverse boxes and the bees correct. You know, making sure that you have the space for your queen to move up, which we're approaching February. I mean, it'll happen before we know it.
You know, on that statement that you made, one of the things that you cannot analyze is when you compare those who did not properly or who did properly do a box reversal and that the conditions were correct. Most of the bees were in the top box, very little in the bottom. They did the reversal. If you compare those who did it properly with those who did it at all, you can't get an accurate grasp of did swarms occur or did they not occur as an overall view of what happens, you know, in a generalized area. And that mine may not have, yours may have. But we're talking about different colony strength. We're talking about different age queens. There's a lot of factors that go into place when you talk about swarming. So the box reversal works really well. There's really not a negative in it as long as we're not disrupting that brood nest.
That's right. Action, reaction.
You remember
your mom saying that? I remember that so well. For every action, there's a reaction. And these two statements on this slide are kind of deep. I'm going to read them out loud, and you're almost, I'm reading it, y'all read it with me, and then you'll need to read it again because it's really kind of, it's not deep, but it's kind of.
And then we have a quiz as to whose words those are.
Okay. The action of a honeybee colony is directed by its primary survival instinct.
I think
that's
that.
Logical. That is logical. The reactions of a honeybee colony are simply adjustments to the original action as to sustain the primary instinct of survival.
But if you think about that, it really does make sense.
It does make sense.
If we think about the things that can cause reactions, beekeepers that do a box reversal, there has to be some kind of result. Either it's positive or it's negative. It would be negative if we don't understand what our colony is telling us when we look at it. It's positive when everything goes right. So the things that can cause a reaction can be cavity size. Maybe maybe our action was that we picked the wrong size box. We picked the wrong size tree. It could be the location. It could be the beekeeper actions, which is what we were talking about.
So often that is always, so often always, that's the problem, right?
So our point that we're wanting to make is that just because your mentor or friend or someone says, have you reversed your boxes? Don't go out and reverse your boxes because of that. Because box reversal is a individual colony decision. Where is the brood?
Well, the specific action or reaction are based upon where the queen is located and her reasonable access to open cells for egg laying. That's really and truly what you're looking for. Available storage space, appropriate locations for incoming resources, and current adult populations. Just know what's really going on before you've made that decision, because your action really could foul things up.
When do we consider doing a box reversal?
Is that your clue for me to flip the slide?
That was it. That's right.
That was good. That was good. And I love these bullet points. And really and truly, we have to ask ourselves every single one of these before we make that. I mean, because it's such an easy process. We could have said, well, this is how you do reversing brood boxes. Boom, here you go. And we'd have been done in about 30 seconds, wouldn't we have?
And that's true. It could be a very simple concept, but it's a concept that you can lose a colony or lose half of a colony if you don't understand. Look at these considerations, and we just grabbed a couple just off the top of our heads. It's things we need to look at. Where are they brooding? We've talked about that.
Top, bottom, or both.
Where's the greatest portion of the brood nest? We talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
Are they in the top? If they are in the top and you add supers, where will the queen expand to?
So, and they're talking about what that is asking is about a honey super too,
That's
because we often think, well, we'll just add a honey super. Well, okay, fine. But if they've all moved up into that top box and you add a honey super, what do you think they're going to do?
Well, the thing
I hear somebody go, I think they're going to make that honey super into a brood box.
Well, the thing I like about that statement, though, and it's not part of that slide, but is if we have a colony that we believe is just right on the edge of being ready to do a reversal on, and we really want to do it, the nectar's coming in heavy, like Blake said, the pollen's blowing in, so the queen's laying. We've got all the indicators that we're going to be building towards a swarm. We can temporarily delay that by adding a honey super to the top of that box and let let the balance of that bottom box move up into that upper box. So that is a delay method.
Absolutely. Next one, if they are not all the way into the top, at that top box still has a honey dome above them, what will they do?
Questions asked. What to do if there's no honey present?
That's right.
So that there's things to look at, and there's a lot. And our goal here again is just to encourage a thought process that, and we teach this in our classes, and that always have a reason for what you're doing in beekeeping, really in life. But we're talking about beekeeping. Understand why you're doing what you're doing, and don't depend on anyone just to tell you to do something if it doesn't make sense.
Just because James and Sherry said
and don't trick yourselves. Always have a reason to do something in beekeeping.
Asking these questions and knowing where resources belong. I think that that's one thing that we try to drill in, especially in our beginner classes, is that you know where resources and bees belong. They really are OCD. Everything has its place. And if we go messing with it in the wrong way, there's times a year where you can go in and move everything around and bees will just forgive you. But there are other times a year like January and February that you really, early February, really need to know what you're doing. So pay attention to these.
Here's two more good questions. What will they do and what will you do? I like that.
Action, reaction.
What will they do? That's
right.
All right.
Options and optional.
I talked about this just a moment ago.
Yeah, you did. You do have options. And yes, reversing brood boxes is optional. Do you want me to read this by Michael Plummer? I can read it. We've had the pleasure of meeting Michael Plummer. He's kind of a cool, I won't call him a dude because he's really kind of a dude, isn't he? He's really kind of
Depends
a dude.
on how you define a dude.
He is.
He's a nice
I was
guy.
going to say old dude, but that would have probably put us in our place. Anyway, to get the bees, he said this is a quote, to get the bees to reversal time, you might need to add an additional box early.
Yeah, I discussed that just a moment ago. That's where I got this.
Yeah, especially if you keep bees in a small brood nest area.
It's becoming more and more popular to use a deep and a medium or multiple mediums.
Or even
so
multiple
that's what
mediums.
he's referring to.
That's right. Early supering, we've talked about this as well, acts like an early reversal without breaking up the brood nest. Then there's room for the bees to expand upward and store nectar overhead. When you do reverse, when the flow is on, some will have very young cells present. Deal with these colonies as you normally would in your swarm controls. The rest will build into strong colonies ready for the main flow.
We answered a major question there. He says, when you do reverse, comma, when the flow is on. So
Yeah.
that's our reversal time.
Yeah.
If we reverse too early, we risk exposing the bees that may be left in that upper box by themselves in a small cluster, either with no food or with no heat.
Yeah.
And we could easily lose that section.
Yeah.
So we analyze each box to determine if it's time, when it's time, if we're going to do it at all.
Yeah.
We're sure that we're not losing bees and making our calls worse than better. And that we have a backup plan, which could be the adding of a super.
That's right. Last slide. There's your clue, Blake. Decision-making time. See this guy sitting in that chair? He's making a decision. Results versus actions or inactions. Don't just do it because reversing is more than just a matter of spring colony management. It's not something that you just go lightly at doing. We reverse some brood boxes, but some we don't. So really and truly make the decision, know what's in there, go out on those warm days and check and see. And if all the bees have moved to the top, make the decision. You may read something that says that there's cons in reversing brood boxes. If that's what you want to do,
I expect Blake would agree that beekeeping is result driven.
It is.
If you don't get the results that you need or that you expected, then you did something wrong or you misunderstood something. Yeah. And the same is true for hobby beekeeping, sideliners. We're all result driven in that we don't want to harm our bees. We want to encourage things to grow faster and understand what their needs are and what they're telling us.
That's right. Well, Blake, that's all we've got. So I'm gonna give this green back.
Thank you, guys.
Sure. You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. That was fantastic. And a couple of quick things. I'm going to reshare my screen here. There we go. Cool. Want to see my screen more than you want to see my face, I promise you. Thank you for that. And yeah, I agree. I mean, beekeeping is so results driven. I mean, and that's what can be so confusing if you're not, you know, if you're not in among the bees every day, like I am, or like James and Sherry are, you know, beekeeping it can be really confusing because it's so results driven and because conditions vary so much. And so something we try hard to do is to break it down for you so that, you know, by giving you some generally true rules to follow, breaking it down month by month. All that being said, there is no substitute for really learning beekeeping and looking at what's going on in your hive and taking action accordingly. So as far as reversing, I mean, James and Sherry did an awesome job at describing reversing. I mean, for me, just to echo what they said, I mean, and I'm going to address this really quickly because I saw there were a lot of questions around this. A lot of people were saying, you know, do the reversing principles still apply if I've got a deep and a medium on my hive instead of 2 deep brood boxes? Yes. You know, a deep and a medium, you know, may still need to be reversed, especially what I often find, and I saw this in a lot of my own hives recently, is, you know, as the winter moves on and the bees all start moving up where all the honey is, up in that top box. Remember, we've been saying you need all this honey up in the second box. We've been feeding all along to get them there. And so the bees go where the honey is this time of year. And so as the bees have all been moving up into that second box, sometimes that bottom box is almost empty. And so they covered this and mentioned this, and I just want to reiterate it, that the reason I like reversing boxes is bees naturally like to move up rather than down. And so by reversing those boxes, you're getting them to move even out of a medium now on the bottom up into that deep where they're supposed to be. And then you can reverse them back once they've cleared out of that bottom box, you know, by March or so, you can reverse them back. And then that medium can be used as a honey super, or you can leave it on as a second brood box. So anyway, it's so many different options and configurations, certainly. So you're welcome to, as the next slide says, oh, let me get to the poll, but you can always email us. If you've got specific questions, shoot us an email and we're more than happy to launch or answer your questions. And I'm going to launch the poll. So here's a quick little poll for you guys. So the question is, how many times did you check your hives in December? And I'm always just curious, well, we'll see how well you guys were paying attention to our recommendations. So, but looks like the majority checked them once, and a close second is shaping up to be twice. So, which is perfect. I mean, you guys are amazing. So, you know, I guess I should have put 0 on there. I forgot to put 0 as an option, but ideally you check them at least once. And a lot of you check them twice, which is great. And then a lot of you overachievers check them more than 5 times. So way to go, overachievers. Perfect. Well, guys, that is almost it for tonight. A couple other really quick things to note. You can always reach out to us. And if you have a question, you can reach out to us at help@texasbeesupply.com. And we're always more than happy to help you guys out. Sorry, I'm taking a picture of that poll so we can put it in our next magazine. We're more than happy to help if you have specific questions for us. And then we'll send a follow-up email with this recording out to you guys, along with a registration link to our February call, links to every product we mentioned, and of course, links to our Texas Bee Supply monthly magazine. One final little note, don't forget to go check out our new website, and you can sign up now for this webinar on that website. So on the main navigation bar, it says monthly tips or monthly webinar, something like that. And now you can put your name and sign up there, and we're switching it. So you don't have to sign up for every single call. So if you go to our website and you sign up, then you'll permanently be on that list, and we'll just send you directly a monthly link to log on to these calls. So go to the website, sign up there, and with that, if you have any further questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll hang around and answer any questions that you have. And hopefully you join us for February. We've got, January is the sort of beginning of spring. February for bees, February is the real beginning of spring. So February, we have a lot to talk about. We're going to start talking about putting on boxes, feeding, swarming, requeening, and there's so many things we're going to get into in February. So I can't wait to see all of you guys there. So have a great January, and we'll talk to you all very soon. Thanks, everybody.